There comes moment, and for most avoidants, this moment arrives with devastating clarity that cannot be undone or unfelt or rationalized away, where they finally understand, truly understand, in their bones and in their gut and in the deepest part of their consciousness, that you were the one. Not just someone they cared about, not just person they enjoyed spending time with, not just another relationship in series of relationships they've cycled through. You were the one they could have built everything with, the life, the future, the partnership, the home, the mornings and evenings and ordinary days that accumulate into something extraordinary simply because they're shared with right person. You were the one who saw them clearly and loved them anyway. You were the one who was patient when patience wasn't owed. You were the one who stayed when leaving would have been justified. You were the one who understood their wounds without making those wounds your burden to carry. You were the one who offered them exactly what they needed most: safety, consistency, genuine acceptance. And they didn't recognize it while it was being offered, because recognizing it would have required them to be vulnerable enough to receive it. And vulnerability was the one thing their entire psychological architecture was designed to prevent. And now that the relationship is over, now that you've moved on, or you're moving on, now that the distance between you has become permanent or feels permanent in ways that make the realization even more crushing, they understand with absolute devastating clarity that they had everything they ever wanted, and they destroyed it, not through any dramatic failure or obvious mistake, but through the quiet, persistent choice to let fear win every single time. Fear and love went to war inside them, and love lost every single time, and you were the casualty of that internal battle. They never learned how to fight differently. The realization doesn't arrive as sudden revelation. It builds gradually through accumulation of moments where they compare what they have now to what they had with you. And the comparison is devastating every single time because nothing else comes close, because no one else has come close. Because in the process of protecting themselves from the vulnerability you represented, they eliminated the only relationship that could have actually given them the life they secretly wanted, but were too afraid to admit they wanted while they were destroying the person offering it to them. The exact moment the realization hits, and why it cannot be taken back. Once it arrives, the realization that you were the one doesn't arrive during dramatic moment or crisis. It arrives quietly during ordinary moment when their defenses are lowered enough for truth to penetrate. And once it penetrates, it cannot be pushed back out regardless of how desperately they try to maintain narrative that protects them from its full impact. The realization arrives when they're alone on evening that would have been perfect if you were there. Dinner they're eating alone that you would have shared. Show they're watching that you would have enjoyed. Quiet evening that has everything except the person who would have made it meaningful. They're sitting in their apartment and everything is comfortable and organized the way they like it, and they have their space and their independence and their freedom from vulnerability that they fought so hard to maintain and protect. And suddenly, the freedom feels like emptiness, and the space feels like loneliness, and the independence feels like isolation, and they realize with horrifying clarity that everything they chose over you, everything they prioritized above the relationship, everything they defended at the cost of love, none of it fills the space you left. The apartment is silent in a way that isn't peaceful, but is hollow. The evening is comfortable in a way that isn't satisfying, but is empty. They have exactly what they chose, and it's exactly nothing compared to what they gave up. And this realization lands with force that no defense can deflect because there's no one to blame and no excuse to construct and no narrative to hide behind. They chose this. They chose this emptiness over you, and now they're living in the consequence of that choice, and the consequence is unbearable. The realization solidifies when they encounter someone new who's interested, someone attractive and available and willing to give them exactly what they want: easy relationship, lots of space, minimal pressure, and they realize they feel nothing. The new person is objectively everything that should appeal to them: uncomplicated, available, not demanding closeness they're not ready to provide, happy to give them the distance and independence they always claimed they needed. And there's absolutely nothing there. No spark, no depth, no feeling that this person matters in ways that would make their life genuinely different if this person left it. They sit across from this new person and they're comparing constantly, not consciously, but unavoidably, to you. And the comparison reveals that what they felt with you wasn't something they can replicate or replace. The ease they always said they wanted turns out to be boring. The space they always demanded turns out to be absence of everything that made love feel like love. The new person gives them everything they claimed to need, and it's hollow proof that what they actually needed was never space or independence, but was you, specifically you, irreplaceably you. And they destroyed that irreplaceable thing while chasing what turned out to be nothing. The realization becomes permanent when they notice they're still comparing you to others, months or years later, and the comparison never favors anyone else. Time was supposed to heal, supposed to create distance, supposed to allow them to move on and find someone new, and eventually forget the specific way you made them feel. But months pass, and the comparison persists. Years pass, and no one has come close to what they felt with you. They date, they try, they remain open to possibility, and nothing compares. Nothing even approaches what they had. The persistence of comparison, the inability to find anyone who creates the same feeling, the consistent recognition that you occupy a unique space in their emotional landscape that no one else can fill. This persistence transforms the realization from temporary painful recognition into permanent truth they must live with. You are the one, not one of many options, the one. And they destroyed the one, and no amount of time or new experience or moving forward will change this fundamental truth about their life, that you are the person they could have had everything with, and they chose differently, and now that choice is permanent. The realization crystallizes when they catch themselves imagining alternative version of their life, version where they chose differently, where they faced their fear instead of running from it, where they stayed present instead of withdrawing, where they said yes to the life you were offering instead of running from it in terror. They imagine themselves in an apartment you would have shared, imagine mornings with you and them, imagine holidays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesdays that would have accumulated into the life they now recognize they wanted. This imagination is painful because it's simultaneously vivid and impossible. They can see exactly how different their life would be, can feel exactly what they lost by choosing fear, can imagine with excruciating clarity the happiness that was available to them and that they eliminated through their own choices. The alternative life feels more real than the life they actually chose. And living in reality while being able to see how different reality could have been if they'd chosen you is specific torture that arrives once the realization solidifies and never fully leaves. The realization becomes inescapable when they attend wedding or see friend's new baby or witness someone else building the life they destroyed possibility of building with you. When they see proof in someone else's life that the life they imagined with you was possible, that the kind of partnership they feared was actually achievable, that other people successfully navigate the exact vulnerabilities they ran from. They watch friend marry person they love. Watch friend become parent. Watch friend build the life. The avoidant was terrified of building, and they realized the fear that prevented them from building this with you wasn't protecting them from something genuinely dangerous, but was preventing them from something genuinely beautiful. Other people did exactly what they couldn't do. Other people faced the vulnerability and weren't destroyed by it. Other people chose love over fear, and their lives are extraordinary as a result. The proof that the life they ran from was actually available, was actually survivable, was actually worth the risk they refused to take. This proof makes the realization permanent and devastating because it eliminates the narrative that they couldn't have done it. They could have. They chose not to. What the realization does to them psychologically, once it can no longer be denied, once the avoidant person reaches the point where they can no longer deny that you were the one, once the realization has fully landed and cannot be rationalized or minimized or defended against, specific psychological consequences unfold that reshape how they understand themselves and their life. Understanding these consequences reveals the depth of impact this realization creates. The realization dismantles the narrative they've constructed about their life being fine without you, exposing it as defensive story they told themselves to survive loss they created. For months or years, they've maintained internal narrative. I'm better off alone. The relationship was too intense. I needed space I couldn't get. Moving on was healthiest choice. These narratives served purpose. They allowed the avoidant to function, to get out of bed, to continue living without confronting full weight of what they destroyed. But the realization strips these narratives away because they're clearly false. They're not better off alone. They're profoundly lonely in ways they've been hiding from themselves. The relationship wasn't too intense. It was exactly right intensity, and they were the one who couldn't handle it. They didn't need space. They needed courage. They didn't develop. The narrative collapses, and what remains beneath it is raw truth. They had extraordinary life available to them. They destroyed it through fear, and they've been telling themselves stories to avoid confronting this truth. The stories are no longer convincing. The truth is all that remains. The realization creates profound identity crisis because it challenges the fundamental belief they've built their entire self-concept around, that independence and self-sufficiency are superior to intimacy and partnership. The avoidant has organized their entire identity around being person who doesn't need others, who's complete alone, who's strong enough to not require a relationship for fulfillment. This identity provided psychological safety for years. But the realization that you were the one and that their life without you is fundamentally diminished reveals this identity as defense mechanism rather than genuine preference. They don't actually prefer being alone. They're suffering from being alone. They don't actually value independence over intimacy. They're mourning the intimacy they destroyed. Their self-concept as independent, self-sufficient person is revealed as elaborate defense against the vulnerability of admitting they need someone. And realizing this defense has cost them everything they actually wanted creates identity crisis, where they don't know who they are if they're not the person who doesn't need anyone. The realization generates specific type of grief that's different from normal relationship grief because it's grief for life they actively chose to destroy rather than for life that was taken from them. When someone leaves you, grief is painful, but carries element of injustice. They left, they made choice, something happened to you. But this grief is about something they did. They left you. They destroyed relationship. They chose fear over love. This creates guilt-infused grief, where every stage of mourning is contaminated by responsibility. They can't grieve without simultaneously confronting their own role in creating the loss. They can't be sad without also being angry at themselves. They can't miss you without also recognizing they're the reason you're gone. This specific type of grief they cause through their own choices, is particularly difficult to process because there's no external person to blame, no external circumstance to point to, no narrative where they're victim of loss rather than architect of it. They built the prison they're grieving inside of, and this knowledge makes the grief heavier and more difficult to move through. The realization triggers intense shame about who they revealed themselves to be through their choices. Shame about being person who had extraordinary love and couldn't sustain it. Shame about being person whose fear was stronger than their capacity to love. They look at themselves and see person who failed at the one thing that mattered most. They see person who couldn't do what millions of other people do. Stay present with someone they love despite discomfort. Face vulnerability despite fear. Choose another person consistently despite wounds that make consistency difficult. They see person who couldn't sustain love that was freely given, couldn't honor trust that was freely offered, couldn't be worthy of patience that was freely extended. This shame about their own character, about who they proved themselves to be through how they treated you, creates wound that sits alongside the wound of losing you. Not just, I lost someone I loved, but I proved I'm not capable of loving someone the way they deserve to be loved. The realization forces them to confront possibility that they might never find what you offered again, that you might have been genuinely unique and irreplaceable in ways they didn't appreciate while you were available to them. This confrontation is terrifying because it suggests they might have permanently eliminated their best chance at the life they wanted through their own behavior. They might date forever and never find what you represented. They might try to be different in future relationships, but never find person who triggers the same depth of feeling and the same sense of being truly seen and understood. The possibility that you were singular, that what existed between you was rare enough that it might never be replicated, makes the realization even more devastating because it adds dimension of permanence to the loss. This might not be temporary setback they'll recover from. This might be permanent consequence of their choices that will define the rest of their life. The realization creates recursive loop where they think about what they did, feel devastated, try to protect themselves from devastation through defensive thinking, recognize the defensive thinking as the same pattern that destroyed the relationship, feel more devastated by their recognition of their own pattern, and cycle repeats without resolution. They're trapped in a loop where the very mechanism that destroyed their relationship with you, defensive thinking that protects from painful feelings, is now being applied to the pain of losing you, and they can see themselves doing it, can recognize the pattern in real time, and cannot stop it, because stopping it would require exactly the vulnerability the pattern exists to prevent. 2. This recursive awareness, seeing themselves repeating the pattern they know destroyed everything, is particularly painful because it suggests the pattern will continue, will affect every future relationship the same way, will continue preventing them from having what they want unless they do fundamental work to change it. The realization isn't just about you. It's about recognizing they'll keep destroying everything good until they address the wounds driving the destruction. Why the realization arrives now, and what triggered it to finally penetrate their defenses. The avoidance realization about you being the one doesn't arrive on schedule or at predictable time. It arrives when specific conditions align to lower their defenses enough for truth they've been avoiding to finally penetrate. Understanding what triggered the realization reveals the psychological conditions required for this kind of devastating clarity. The realization arrives now because enough time has passed that the acute pain of the relationship ending has subsided enough for clearer thinking to emerge. In immediate aftermath of relationship ending, everything was consumed by survival, managing the pain, maintaining the defenses, creating narratives that allowed continued functioning. This survival mode prevented clear thinking about what was actually lost, because clear thinking about loss would have created pain too severe to manage while simultaneously trying to function. But enough time has passed now that the acute survival mode has shifted to chronic quiet suffering. And in this quieter suffering, there's space for clarity that wasn't available during the crisis. The defenses have relaxed enough, not disappeared, but relaxed, that truth can slip through gaps that were sealed tight when everything was raw and immediate. Time didn't heal the wound, but it did create conditions where the wound could be examined honestly rather than simply survived. The realization arrives now because they've tried enough alternative options to recognize none of them provide what you provided, eliminating the possibility that someone else might fill the space. In the period after the relationship, there might have been hope, conscious or unconscious, that someone else would come along who would create same feeling, same depth, same sense of being truly known. This hope kept the realization at bay because hope suggested the loss might not be permanent, that what was destroyed with you might be rebuilt with someone new. But enough attempts to find replacement have occurred now that this hope has been systematically eliminated through evidence. No one else creates what you created. No one else provides what you provided. The hope that sustained the defense against full realization has been exhausted through repeated disappointment, and without hope to maintain the defense, the truth arrives with full force. The realization arrives now because they've watched someone else build the life they could have built with you, providing concrete proof that the life they feared wasn't actually dangerous, but was actually beautiful. Something specific has occurred. Friend's wedding, colleague's new baby, family member's anniversary celebration, that made abstract possibility suddenly concrete and visible. They can see in someone else's life exactly what their life could have looked like if they'd chosen differently. The proof isn't hypothetical anymore. It's tangible, observable, real. Someone they know is living the exact life the avoidant destroyed possibility of living with you, and seeing this life from outside, rather than imagining it from inside, creates clarity that imagination alone couldn't create. The concrete evidence that the life was possible, that it was survivable, that it was worth the risk. This evidence makes the realization undeniable, because it's not just their own speculation anymore, but observable reality that someone managed to achieve. The realization arrives now because they've finally developed enough self-awareness, possibly through therapy, possibly through painful reflection, possibly through accumulation of painful consequences, to see their own patterns clearly enough to understand what they did and why they did it. Earlier, their patterns were invisible to them or were justified through narratives that prevented honest examination. But something has shifted in their self-awareness. Maybe they've started therapy. Maybe they've read enough about attachment to recognize themselves in descriptions. Maybe enough painful consequences have accumulated that denial is no longer sustainable. And this increased self-awareness has created capacity to see what they did to you with clarity they previously lacked. The realization arrives not because circumstances have changed, but because their capacity to see themselves honestly has changed. And this honest self-perception reveals the truth about you and about what they destroyed that was always true, but couldn't be seen until their awareness developed enough to perceive it. The realization arrives now because something about current moment in their life has created contrast that makes the loss unbearably visible. Maybe they're celebrating birthday alone, and you used to make their birthday special. Maybe holiday season has arrived, and holidays without you reveal the absence that existed beneath the surface of their supposedly fine life. Maybe they've achieved something significant, and the person they want to celebrate with is you, and you're not there and won't be there. These contrast moments, where current reality is placed side by side with what reality could have been, create conditions where the realization cannot be avoided because the contrast is too stark to rationalize or explain away. The gap between what is and what could have been becomes visible in ways that demand acknowledgement, and the realization arrives as unavoidable recognition of the size of that gap, what their realization means for you, and whether it changes anything about where things stand. The avoidant's devastating realization that you were the one they could have had everything with creates specific implications for you, for how you understand the relationship, and for whether this realization changes anything about your situation. Understanding what their realization means helps you navigate your own healing with clarity, rather than with false hope or unnecessary pain. Their realization means you were right all along. The connection was real. The potential was genuine. What you felt wasn't one-sided or imagined, but was authentic, mutual experience that was destroyed not by incompatibility, but by their inability to sustain it. You spent time questioning yourself, wondering if you were imagining the depth of connection, wondering if you were investing in something that wasn't truly mutual, wondering if your perception of significance was inflated by your own feelings. Their realization confirms your perception was accurate. The connection was real. The potential was genuine. You weren't imagining anything. What existed between you was extraordinary, and it was mutual, and it was destroyed, not because it wasn't enough, but because they couldn't handle how much it was. This confirmation serves your healing by validating your experience. You weren't foolish for loving them, weren't naive for believing in what existed, weren't wrong about the significance of what you shared. You were right about all of it. Their realization does not obligate you to wait for them, to take them back, to give them another chance, simply because they finally understood what they destroyed. Understanding what they lost and being capable of sustaining it differently are two entirely separate things. Regret doesn't equal readiness. Recognition of what they destroyed doesn't equal transformation of the patterns that destroyed it. They might understand completely what they lost and still be incapable of sustaining healthy relationship, because understanding doesn't automatically create capacity that didn't previously exist. Before any consideration of re-engagement, they would need to demonstrate sustained behavioral change through consistent therapeutic work over a significant period. Not just understanding, not just regret, not just recognition, but actual demonstrated capacity to show up differently than they showed up before. Their realization means they're currently in one of most painful psychological states a person can experience. Grief, combined with responsibility, combined with loss of self-concept, combined with recognition that their own choices created permanent consequence. This level of psychological pain doesn't necessarily lead to positive change. Sometimes it leads to deeper defense, to greater withdrawal, to more intense avoidance of the feelings that the realization has created. Whether their pain becomes catalyst for genuine growth or becomes reason for even deeper defense is something only they can determine through their choices about how to respond to this realization. You cannot influence this choice. You cannot make them use their pain productively. You can only recognize that their current state is painful and that the outcome of that pain is entirely in their hands. Their realization means you can release yourself from responsibility for their suffering while also releasing yourself from hope that their suffering will lead to them reaching out. Their pain is their responsibility. It's consequence of their choices, and they must navigate it through their own work and their own choices about how to respond. You don't owe them comfort. You don't owe them forgiveness. You don't owe them opportunity to demonstrate change. Their realization and their suffering, however genuine, don't create obligation on your part to do anything. Similarly, you shouldn't wait for their realization to lead to action directed toward you. They might never reach out, might never express regret directly, might process their realization entirely internally without ever making it visible to you. Waiting for their realization to produce specific outcome directed at you keeps you tethered to them when your healing requires moving forward, regardless of what they do or don't do with their own pain. Their realization ultimately means the most powerful thing you can do for yourself isn't anything related to them, but is continuing to build the life you are offering to share with them. Because building that life proves you didn't need them to have it, proves you're creating the extraordinary existence they now recognize they could have shared, and proves that the life they destroyed possibility of was never dependent on their participation, but was always yours to build. Regardless of whether they chose to join you in it, they now understand you were the one they could have had everything with. Let the most healing response be demonstrating through your actual life that you're having everything anyway, not despite them, not to prove point, but because you deserve the life you were offering to share, and you're going to have it whether they're part of it or not. Their realization confirms you are extraordinary. Your response confirms you always knew that, even when they couldn't see it, even when they were too afraid to stay close enough to witness it. Even now, especially now, the extraordinary life continues. With or without them, it was always yours.